That sort of sounded like a singles ad, which it was not. In 1987, when I was 17 years old and a junior at Tam High, I came home from school once, and there was my mother sitting at our kitchen table, looking kind of stricken, and she let out one of those "we need to talk" kind of sighs. And she proceeded to tell me that she had just been informed that the man who she thought was her father for 40-some-odd years, a man named Glen, who was this sort of exceedingly handsome but alcoholic Irish seaman, was actually not her father, and that her real father was a Swedish communist named Per Eriksson who lived in Stockholm. And my mom was about the age I am now. If you were doing the math, I'm 41, I'll just tell you. She was in her early 40s, and what I understand now is that part of what she was telling me was that the entire foundation upon which her identity had been built and how she understood herself had just been flattened. And not only that, but many of the important people in her life had been lying to her entire life. And from the depths of my amazing teenage empathy, what I said to her in return was, "Oh my God, do we get to go to Europe?" And we would actually get to go to Europe, but that would come later. So my grandmother, Dasha, my mom's mom, was this tiny Ukrainian Jew who immigrated to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, and she had a big gray Jew fro, and she favored dashikis and muumuus, and in her young adult life was quite a bohemian. She was a fortune teller, and she was in a lot of plays, and she hung around with artists and a lot of lefty political types and union people, and she was this really sort of interesting, not very conventional woman of her time, in some regards. And then she was also this sort of like old world Jewish woman who made me eat sardine sandwiches and steamed cow's tongue as a snack. And once told me never to act too smart because boys wouldn't like me. So she was always sort of, I don't know, about 65% off her rocker. But by the time I was in high school, she had Alzheimer's. And she could by then sing these songs from her youth in Russian, but she could no longer remember my name, which is why my mother was skeptical when my grandmother told her that her father was a Swedish communist named Per Eriksson living in Stockholm. So my mother decided to do a little recon, and she turned to some old family friends who had been friends with my grandmother since the 30s and known my mother since she was born, Jean and Leonard, and she asked them what was up. And what Jean said in return was, "Oh, thank God, you finally know." And that was all the confirmation my mom really needed, and it turned out it was true, and it turned out that many people, on request from my grandmother, had been lying to my mom for the 40-some-odd years of her life. And so she set about trying to find out as much about this Per Eriksson fellow in this story as she could, and she couldn't ask my grandmother, obviously. Her memory was spotty at best. So she turned to this sort of larger group of friends that my grandmother had been hanging out with since the 30s and who would know this story. And I think a lot of young people, when they think about old people, they think about bland food and overheated rooms and Lawrence Welkins. But when I was a teenager and I thought about old people, I thought about marches against U.S. occupation in El Salvador and beat up old Toyotas with political bumper stickers on them and old men in berets singing union songs. And my old people were fiercely political and they drank a lot of red wine out of water glasses. And so these were the people my mom turned to. And the story that she learned was sort of kind of the stuff of romance novels, if the romance novels you read are sort of steeped in lefty politics and kind of depressing. But what she learned was that Per Eriksson was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He was part of the International Brigades, which was people from all over the world who volunteered to fight against Franco and the fascists in the mid-30s in Spain, like many of the Americans that my grandmother had hung out with of her era. And that in the 40s he had come to San Francisco and he'd been the head of the Swedish Seamen's Union here, and that's where he and my grandmother had met. And she fell madly in love with him. I think in part maybe because he was unlike her husband Glen in some important ways. He was kind, and he was not an alcoholic, and he was friendly, and he was not exceedingly handsome. In fact, he was described as being soft, which I don't think is the most flattering adjective for a man, but so they had an affair, and my grandmother got pregnant. And unfortunately, Per did not fall madly in love with my grandmother, despite the fact that she showed up at his doorstep wearing nothing but a fur coat. But Per knew about my mom. He knew about her birth. And the great mystery of this story is whether Glenn ever knew. He died when my mom was 13, and we don't know if he knew or not that my mother was not actually his biological child, and we'll never know. But in the mid-40s, late 40s, Per was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in the sort of hysteria of that era, my grandmother was completely freaked out by this and didn't want to be associated with anyone under investigation, and she cut off all contact with him. And then in 1950, he was kicked out of the country by Joe McCarthy and those guys for good. And that was the last anyone had ever heard of him. So it's 1987, and it's not so easy to find people then. There's no Google and Facebook and internet, and especially people in other countries. How do you go about finding this long-lost father of yours in Sweden who may or may not even be alive? So lucky for us, it's 1987, which is the 50th year of the end of the Spanish Civil War. And Spain is hosting a reunion for all the international brigadistas. And Jean and Leonard are going, because Leonard's also a vet. And they tell my mom that they'd be happy to bring a letter to Per, to Spain. If he's alive, he will surely be there. So my mom writes this letter, and this letter is long gone. And I don't know that I ever read it. I certainly, if I did, I don't remember the content. But I imagine that it's, you know, hopeful and nervous and excited, and maybe also a little embarrassed, or I don't know, it's a weird letter to write. What do you say? You know, hi, I'm your long-lost daughter. What's up? I don't know what was in the letter, but she wrote it, and she was so nervous that she forgot to include any contact information, no phone number, no address, nothing. She sends it off to Spain with Jean and Leonard. And again, I don't know what happened in Spain except from hearsay, but I imagine it being the last day of this rather grand reunion in Spain, and they're in this huge hotel ballroom, and it's filled with all these aging Spanish Civil War vets in their lopsided black berets, and you know, they're in various states of decay, and you know, some of them are in wheelchairs, and some of them have canes, and some of them are still quite robust deep into their 80s. It's like a giant room filled with old lefty Ernest Hemingways. And there are Jean and Leonard, you know, looking out for Per, and Per, of course, has no idea what's coming at him. And then they see him across this big ballroom, and they make their way over there, and they see each other, and it's the first time they've seen each other in almost 40 years. And I'm sure it's, you know, it's kind of shocking, but then also probably not so shocking in the way that you go to a reunion, you expect to see people. And I imagine maybe Jean could only stand a couple of minutes of chit-chat before she couldn't stand it any longer, and she thrusts the letter at Per, and I don't know what she says, but, you know, this is from your daughter. So 3 or 4 weeks later, my mother and I receive in the mail one of those telltale blue airmail crinkly envelopes from Per, who has managed to track us down despite the lack of address or phone number, probably through Jean and Leonard. And he invites us to Stockholm. And so that summer, we go to Stockholm to meet him, and it's sort of this accumulation of my teenage dream to go to Europe. It's not Paris, it's Stockholm, it'll do. So armed with photo albums and, you know, what we consider to be our most European outfits, we get on the plane and we go to Stockholm, and we get off the plane, and there's Per Eriksson. And he is also wearing a black Spanish Civil War vet beret, and he's this old, soft man, rather fat, with these bright blue eyes, and he greets us with this big bouquet of flowers, as people do in Sweden, at least old people, that's how they greet you, when you arrive. And I don't remember a lot from that first day, except being really impressed that our taxi was a Volvo. And so he takes us back to his sort of mid-century blocky apartment building in the outskirts of Stockholm, and he sleeps in his late wife's art studio and gives us his bedroom. And there on his dresser is a baby picture of my mother. And it's not the little one that she included in the envelope to Spain. It's this big 8x10, and it's in a 40-year-old frame. And it's sort of jarring to see it there and to know that all this time my mom has had sort of this ghost life that exists only in memory and somebody's imagination, all these miles away for all this time, way over in Sweden. And this sort of begins this 10-year process of us becoming family and getting to know each other. And part of it is incredibly romantic and exciting. Per is a romantic figure. He's friends with all these incredibly impressive people, parliamentarians and artists and journalists and textile artists. I'd never heard of that when I was 17. And you know, former members of this Moscow Symphony Orchestra, and everyone he knows seems to be really smart and really accomplished. And it's really thrilling for me, and maybe also thrilling for my mom. But it's also mundane and irritating the way the family is. He has the table manners of like a toddler mixed with a gorilla, and his dentures clack horribly, and he listens to the BBC at 5 a.m. and top volume, no matter your jet lag. And he is prone to giving these pedantic lectures on the difference between progressives and liberals. Liberals are bad, progressives are good, just so you know. And, you know, so it's not just this star in the eye, perfect reunion. But over the course of the 10 years that we get to know him before he dies, we do become a family, and we visit him often in Sweden. And he finally, after 50 years away, comes back here and visits us in Sausalito. And over that time, I think my mother really did become his daughter, and I really did become his granddaughter. And so much so that now, 15 years after he died, I think we both still consider ourselves Swedish. Thank you.